thank you very much for coming. So I speak very fast, so if it gets too fast, just let me know. So my thesis today will be somewhat provocative in that I would like to challenge the prevailing conceptions of the problem of surveillance in contemporary society, which, as far as I take them, are mostly legalistic and technological. And what I would like to argue instead is that we can only understand both the problem of surveillance and the means to fight back only if we conceive of surveillance as primarily an economic and political issue. I know it sounds very abstract, but hopefully it will get much more sharper by the end of my talk. So the thesis that I would like to advance today is not only that we are wrong in thinking about surveillance as primarily a matter of legal and technological processes, but also that unless we can understand the new nexus that has emerged between technology companies that are very data intensive, and they are primarily located in Silicon Valley and are very, very well familiar with what they are, and the state. And the state at this point is primarily a very neoliberal state obsessed with marketization, markets, and efficiency. We would not be able to understand what is happening today. And furthermore, the third and kind of final thesis that I would like to make today is that, in a sense, the only way to make sense of Silicon Valley today is to think about it as some kind of a replacement for the institutions of the welfare state. And I know that this might sound a bit provocative to some of you, because those who have spent any time in Silicon Valley would probably know that the very last thing you would accuse those people of is of liking or wanting to replicate the welfare state. The way in which we traditionally think of them is actually the very opposite. Those are mostly people who celebrate the power of markets, who are very much libertarian. Some of them have named their children after characters in various Ayn Rand novels. So they're not necessarily the closeted communists that I would like to present them as today. Nonetheless, I think it is a very important shift in the functions that Silicon Valley performs today, and I think it's very important to understand what it does, primarily from this economic perspective and paradigm. So let me just unpack the slogan. And as a slogan, Silicon Valley, the new welfare state, I think it actually works quite well. So let me unpack that slogan. So what I think started happening around 15 or so years ago with the emergence of various companies like Yahoo, Google, and so forth, is that we have seen one particular sector of what has previously passed for the welfare state, meaning, but specifically information and telecommunication sector. Think about email, think about search, think about any basic way in which you used to communicate with each other, other institutions, or look up information. That itself slowly was being disrupted by those companies, right? If you look at the way in which Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and others have sprung up, much of what they wanted to do was basically to make our communication between each other much faster, much simpler, but also freer. And freer, what I mean by this is not in any kind of political sense, but in actual economic sense. It just happens to be the case that if you look at who actually bears the costs of rolling out this basic infrastructure, it happens to be those companies. And we can argue to what extent they themselves receive funding from the state, Defense Department, military, industrial complex, and so forth, but primarily the costs of you using an email service from Google or a search engine or any of these other alternative services is essentially being cared for by those firms themselves. It's not being paid for by you directly as a fee, as you did with many other institutions, and it's not paid necessarily by taxes, right? So there is an actor in this model who is paying for its provision, and it just happens to be Silicon Valley companies, right? Clearly, they're not doing it because they they want all of us to communicate for free, and they just believe in the public provision of this infrastructure. They do it for a very different reason, and the reason being that they have found a way to derive business benefits and build an entire business model around this, whereby they can actually provide many of those infrastructural assets for free while making a lot of money from the collection and selling of the data that is produced in the process of us using those services, right? And then if you look at the communication and sort of information technology sector as such, I would argue that was sort of the first stage of their intrusion into that sector. So you had email search and similar services being offered more or less for free on the assumption that data will eventually pay for their use. And you can see that institutions that function on a somewhat different logic, whether it was the post office, which was the institutions through which we used to communicate, or the library, that also function on a very different model and logic of getting access to information than a search engine like Google, they somewhat have been sidestepped in the process, and there is a very, it requires a lot of creativity as to argue as to why the post office in its current form, if you just think about letters and not shipments of goods, should actually exist. And you can make a political argument about, you could make an argument, but from a purely economic perspective, there is quite a lot that has changed with Silicon Valley adopting this very efficient and hyper fast modes of communication, right? I would argue that even the shipments of goods as one function of the post office that still remains relevant will itself soon be replaced, if not by UPS and FedEx, then by a fleet of Uber drivers who will be fetching passengers and taking them along the way wherever they go and do a delivery, or by a fleet of drones that Amazon wants to launch in the next few years. So even that function will in one sense or another be taken care of. Who will pay for it is to be decided, but I would argue that you should think even of the logistical aspects of this as something that can essentially be taken on by this industry. Right? And of course, the ultimate implication that I think we have to focus on is that ultimately there is a rhetoric of not just social inclusion, but also of some kind of welfareism involved in this, because ultimately those services, unlike say the post office, is free for the ordinary people to use. So you can see how the populism around Silicon Valley can grow and increase as they are claiming that they are the vehicle through which the poor and the excluded and the people who cannot pay for the provision of many services could now suddenly get access to them because the services themselves are free, right? I would argue that search and email being the first stage of this kind of new model, we now moved into a second stage, especially in the developing world, where these companies are also rolling out not just basic services for looking up information or communication, but also for getting people online in the first place. So if you look at some of the efforts that Google has been doing with its project Loon, which is a network of balloons that will be beaming internet access to the developing world, or if you look at Facebook's experiments and efforts with a project called internet.org, you will see that there the logic is not very different, whereby what these companies want to do is to cover the, as many of the developing countries as they can with nominally free access to telecommunications, meaning they will get them online under a very specific set of conditions, and I'll explain what those conditions are, but they will nonetheless get those people online, right? And that will happen for free, so users themselves will need not pay for a basic set of services. So if you are somewhere in an African country or in an Asian country or in a country somewhere in Latin America, you can suddenly get online now for free with the help of services like internet.org, which operate along the same logic. They want you to get online. The online that they get you on is very limited. You mostly get access to Facebook and a handful of other apps, be it Wikipedia or some weather app. For the rest, you have to pay, right? So it's not by any means a vision for a universalist kind of everything for everybody vision of telecommunications that we might have had 20 or 30 years ago. It's a model of communications that is highly limited to a few websites that harvest data and then find a way to monetize that data. Right? So you have basically Facebook that will be free, Google that will be free, everything else you'll have to pay for. And since those companies now provide a plethora of services that you yourself can use, you might not even notice that because the rest of the internet will not exist as far as you're concerned because you'll have to pay for it. But Google and Facebook themselves now provide so much that you'll actually be content to continue using their services for free without paying anything, right? That's the sort of the logic according to which the rollout of connectivity across the world now is being provided. So again, you can clearly see certain aspects of social inclusion, certain aspects of, we care for the poor, we want everybody to get online, blah, blah, that Silicon Valley is so good at, right? Again, the logic here and the rhetoric here is all about empowerment, all about providing services that are free, that no other actor currently can provide at that scale, because you cannot conceive a consortium of governments now wanting to create giant balloons that will be beaming internet in a remote place somewhere in Africa. I would argue that if you use that lens to look at transformations in many other sectors of the economy, you will see very similar developments. If you look at transportation, you will see Uber employing a somewhat similar set of tools, all involving data, sensors, and the ability to make supply meet demand in real time in order to provide, as they would claim, a more flexible and better living for the driver, a somewhat contentious point that a lot of people have disputed, and lower rates for the passenger. And I think we should not overestimate the lower rates for the passenger element, because the amounts of and the kinds of optimizations that Uber can engage with, thanks to the giant infrastructure of sensors, real-time communications that they have set up, does lead to somewhat lower rates for the passenger, which explains why so many people are keen to use Uber, right? And you can see that logic being driven into the future with lower and lower rates resulting from the economy of scale that Uber will get once it operates on a global level, and eventual replacement of drivers with self-driving cars, whereby you will actually have Uber providing anything close to a public-like transportation system for which you will have to pay, but which would nonetheless be, in many cases, the only alternative that's currently on offer that covers all the sectors of the city, of the region, of the nation. Right? Here again, there are all sorts of complications, and I'm not arguing for Uber, I'm not arguing for Silicon Valley, I'm just trying to sort of offer more of a sociological lens on both the rhetoric that they engage in to justify what they do, and it's a rhetoric of empowerment, social inclusion, and as I've said, trying to be what the welfare state aspired to be by providing many of the services at a much cheaper, at a much cheaper rate, and trying to sort of understand what enables them, right? So, and then once you move beyond Uber, right, you will see similar trends happening in other domains. Housing, again, you look at the Airbnb pitch. The pitch that comes from Airbnb is that basically the fact that now we can have information loops going back and forth between suppliers and of houses and guests allows us to utilize those resources more effectively, which basically means that A, people who open up their doors to strangers can make a living, so they can earn an extra few $100s every month and thus supplement their otherwise stagnating income. And people who travel around can also find options that would be more affordable and will allow them to basically escape the clutches of hotel industry, which is overcharging them, right? You again see how the fact that you can actually have a more efficient flow of information results in some kind of lower delivery of, lower rates for the delivery of those services, right? And what unites both Uber and Airbnb, besides everything I've just mentioned, is also that they're very keen to leverage reputations of both drivers or hosts and customers, right? And I think we should not overestimate that element. The fact that we are using those services not in a quasi-anonymous manner, as was the case with public transportation under the previous model, or with hotels as well, is very significant. And there you can also see how the fact that the services are provided by private actors basically means that they would like to reduce their transaction costs as much as they can, which also means that they actually have an incentive to have you ranked and rated as often as possible, because that will enable them to automatically separate people who are trustworthy from people who are not, and thus exclude whoever falls below a certain rating, so that not to incur any risks of these people causing any damage to the property or the car or whatever. Right? So there is an incentive built into the system to accumulate reputation. Right? And it serves a very simple economic logic, this accumulation of data for those companies, because they operate, again, on the logic of efficiency and on the logic of using those resources as effectively as possible so that they can charge lower rates, right? And consumers actually, those who are not likely to be excluded by the switch to the ranking system, are more than happy to accept that because, again, that results in lower rates. And if the lower rates is the only thing that you care about, there is a very good argument to be made that yes, actually having a ranking or reputation system is not such a bad thing, because ultimately it means you'll be paying less for your Uber ride or for your stay at an Airbnb house. I'll just give you a couple of more examples just to show that I'm not being paranoid. And then I'll try to draw some very political and economic implications of this. If you look at health, I would argue that for the large part, the argument is very much the same. The fact that now you have more sensors in built environment, but also in our gadgets and virtually everywhere we go, allows to generate data about what we do, what we eat, how much we exercise, analyze our sleeping patterns, and then that in turn allows for all sorts of optimizations that were not possible before, right? That has one particular meaning. If you look at the way in which insurance is provided, clearly here, for people who happen to be well off and who happen to eat well and exercise and have the time to take care of themselves, there would be a net benefit as they can actually leverage that data in order to get better treatment and better rates from the insurance company, with some people who are not well off and do not exercise and do not eat healthily, clearly being punished for their non-compliance with the health plan. But there is also a different political logic, right? And what I'm trying to argue here, it's not that Silicon Valley's model of welfare maps out one-to-one to the model of the welfare state. And no, by the way, am I celebrating the welfare state. It had its own problems and it had as much surveillance, or at least it had its own issues with it. All I'm trying to say is that the logic by which health is conceived in the realm of Silicon Valleyism, if you will, is a logic that basically conceives of health as something that's solely the result of your own individual behavior, right? So the conception of health is entirely individualistic and assumes that it's you who is supposed to be responsible for exercise, healthy diet, and so forth, and all the other social factors, the power of food corporations, lobbyists, food standards, all of that sort of gets off the table, right? So it's a very individualistic narrative, which might result, of course, in us becoming healthier, right? I'm not trying to oppose the efficiency and the efficacy of the program. It might as well be that once you internalize that logic and you start tracking every single aspect of your life, including how much exercise, sleep, and everything else you do, you will actually become healthy as a result. I mean, it's actually probable you will become healthy as a result, but it doesn't mean that there are no political and other elements to this program that should not be analyzed as well when we conceive of alternatives to this highly individualistic provision of health, right? And I'll just mention one more example and then I'll move on. If you look at financial inclusion, which is very similar to communication and very similar to the health and transportation examples that I've mentioned, you can again see how the rhetoric of social empowerment that Silicon Valley sort of engages in is very explicit. When it comes to financial inclusion, the argument put forward by all of these data-intensive startups is that basically as long as we can monitor 10,000 indicators or data points about your everyday life, we would be able to predict how trustworthy you are, and based on those criteria, we would then be able to give you a loan, while before your choices were either not getting a loan from a bank because you didn't have a credit history, or dealing with a loan shark and thus paying 200% interest rate. So Silicon Valley, by analyzing tiny elements of our everyday behavior, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal just this week which said that they even analyzed the way in which we charge our battery. So people who charge their batteries more often or regularly with certain patterns can actually be perceived as being more reliable than people who don't. And once you add up 10,000 elements like this, what you do in your browser, whom you call and when, at what hours of the day, you can actually arrive at a more accurate risk profile that you can then use in order to determine who is eligible for a loan or not, in a way that would in fact open up access to loans to people who have previously been excluded on terms that are in fact better than those of loan sharks, right? With all of that, the conclusion I'm slowly trying to get at is that there are actually quite a few incentives for people who have all sorts of problems, which might have to do with income, they might have to do with health, they might have to do with their ability to get a loan, they might have to do with their inability to make their ends meet, in actually engaging in all sorts of methods and all sorts of practices of self-monitoring, surveillance, however you want to describe it. It's just the economic and political, but mostly economic incentives are so great that it's impossible to ignore that aspect. And for many people in the developing world, it's not even a matter of incentives. If you do want to get online and you have no cash to pay, your best bet at this point is internet.org and whatever will be provided by Google, right? So you can clearly see that it would be somewhat premature, and I would argue actually irresponsible, to start blaming all of us, or at least those of us who are using those services, for the types of behavior we engage in, because this is not driven by just some sort of epistemic misunderstanding of the consequences of surveillance, or is driven somehow by us not grasping the ultimate political consequences. I would argue that such ethical posture towards people who are using Google services or Facebook services or Uber and Airbnb and everything else is just not very productive. And I know the sort of the ironic implications of that word. So I would also say that to really understand how this new kind of Silicon Valley welfarism functions, it's not enough just to look at a bunch of companies and what they do. It's also very important to look at what is it that enables these types of optimization, right? And what kind of political and economic biases these types of optimization and efficiency gains have. And this is where we do have to understand the role that data plays in making these predictions possible. So if you look at Google, right? And Google has, as I've mentioned, some of the basic parts of this new system. Search, email, they might soon have health, life extension, you name it. I mean, they're clearly present here. But I would argue that to really understand how this new world would function and the role that data plays, you really have to look at a different service run by Google, and that service is called Google Now. Right? And for me, Google Now is the epitome, and it's a very good example of the paradigm in which constant self-tracking, constant use of these services, which basically use data and advertising markets to pay for their provision, ultimately Google Now is the system which seeks to derive most benefits from those practices. Right? So what does Google Now do? Google Now is a very simple, in some sense, service which basically analyzes your presence across different Google properties, first of all. So everything you search for, your entire inbox, things you look up on Google News, your calendar, and so forth. And then it also now analyzes your activity on other sites. Music you listen to on Spotify, if your profile is integrated with it, bookings you make on Airbnb, transactions you have with Uber, and so forth. So basically, your entire present in this new digital economy can be integrated into Google Now for the sole reason that a lot of this passes through your inbox, and your inbox at this point happens to be run by, in most cases, just one company, and that company is Google. Right? So the fact that Google has access more or less to 90% of your digital life allows them to optimize it in a way that is currently impossible for any other actor. So what Google now does is that they seek to basically cut out a lot of slack and cut out a lot of middleware and middle work from you getting by in your everyday living. Right? So if you have made a plane reservation and you bought a plane ticket, of course you can look it up on your own in your email a day before, or you can look at Google Now and that reservation will already be there waiting for you with all the details, including weather to destination and whatnot. Right? And the same applies to your reservations in restaurants, the same applies to basically any other kind of social activity that you engage in that is mediated by one of those platforms. Which means that also meetings, you name it. If you mention, I mean, a lot of you use it, I assume, because it's present virtually on most Android phones now, and probably is also available on for the iOS. But those of you who don't use it will realize the benefits of it. You've written an email to somebody and you said, let's meet tomorrow at 5 p.m. at this cafe. You don't have to tell Google anything. Google will understand that you have a meeting coming up and it will put it on your calendar on Google Now. Right? Thus reminding you that you need to be there and doing all the other necessary logistical and infrastructural work for you to get there. I would argue that here Google is very actually honest about what they do, and the name Google Now gives away the secret, and the goal here is just to generate time out of thin air. Basically by converting everything Google knows about you and people like you, and converting all of the data that you have shared with them for the purposes of analysis into free time. That's very basic transaction, right? And it also means that the more you open up, the more parts and areas of your everyday living and everyday existence you open up for analysis by Google or any other player at this point that uses your email to get to you will also be optimized, right? Which means that, in a sense, if you refuse to use those services, or if you use encryption, or if you're not on Gmail, you can think about it as a tax on your time. Yes, of course, you can hire a private secretary if you have one, and your secretary will take care of all those things. Or you can just spend hours and hours on end taking care of your business. It's your choice, right? Or you can just say, I open up, and Google will run that back end for me. And at this point, this is what it is. That's the back end to our life, to use a very technical sort of technological term. And it means to me that many of us who again, engage in some kind of ethical discourse, trying to tell users not to do it, have a very hard time understanding the economic pressures that exist on people to basically run their daily life efficiently because of parenting obligations, 2 jobs they might have, and whatnot. Which means that as long as Google Now and Google as a company offers you the means to generate time and generate some time from the otherwise very competitive and harsh demands of your work and other social obligations, people will continue using it. Because other ways of generating time, which, in the past, how did we generate time? Well, we had collective negotiations between labor and capital. And you actually would go and try to get some time otherwise, which would not require perpetual surveillance. You can sort of, it's a very basic thing I'm saying. It's not rocket science, but I think it's very important to understand that at this point, if you think of generating of free time as one of the overarching political objective of some kind of emancipatory leftist project, unfortunately, it's Google that does it now. Which brings me to my 4th point, which has more to do with the state than it does with Silicon Valley. I think we have to understand why there is so little resistance to the intrusion of those companies into various sectors of the economy. And the reason, I think, there are several, and I think we have to understand all of them. First of all, in a sense, if you had to think back 40 years ago, 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, and you had to imagine what would the future of the neoliberal state look like, right? You'd probably say that, hey, everything will be, you'll have to pay a price for everything, yes? Everything will be some kind of a commodity for which you'll actually have to go and pay dearly because everything will become a rather expensive undertaking as the private sector takes over the public sector in providing those goods and services. So, you know, the initial assumption that you would have 20 or 30 years ago would be that education will become privatized and more expensive, health will become more expensive, transportation will become more expensive, communication will become more expensive, and so forth. Right? But that's not what's happening, right? Actually, many of those things are becoming cheaper for the sole reason that there is, I mean, and of course they're provided on a very different political and sociological and economic model, so I'm not equating the content or the model, but they are becoming cheaper, right? Which to me means that for a lot of neoliberals who are in charge, it's a very convenient development, in part because it allows to preserve one of the founding myths of this ideology, which is that ultimately technology and innovation left to the market itself will bring us the kind of social advancement and progress that you would not be able to generate otherwise. And with some rhetorical tricks, you can actually make that narrative look true so that venture capitalists in California right now can claim to be the main vehicles for social progress because they happen to invest in Uber and Airbnb, which allow people to make all the supplementary income or pay lower prices for transportation. I mean, this is sort of where we are, and people who have endorsed or advocated liberalization of many of the sectors of the economy and the transfer of power to the private sector, and especially the technology companies, actually can claim some credit for enabling all of that. So you can clearly see that if Silicon Valley was not doing that, I would argue that there will be many more angry people out there concerned by the fact that their jobs no longer pay them if they happen to have them, which is a big if, healthcare system is crumbling, and in places where it was not privatized, like the United Kingdom, it could not actually treat the number of elderly, overweight, and many other types of people who are currently exerting extreme demands on the system. And you can take that list and generate a very kind of nightmarish scenario, which in one way or another, Silicon Valley is now able to avoid, but through a very particular set of tricks, so that yes, it's true that the National Health Service system in the United Kingdom still does not have the money to pay for all of the people who are becoming elderly, especially as it's being further shrunk by the very same neoliberal project. It's not like they kept their budgets are still being shrunk, right? While the number of claimants is increasing. And you're up in a situation where the only way to preserve the semblance of normality in the system is to actually bring in the robots. So you bring in the robots, and they're the ones who are now providing care for the elderly by employing all sorts of sensors, data analytics, and whatnot to understand when to intervene, both on an emotional, psychological level, but also when to detect falls, when people fall, you know, and whatnot in the senior care facility. And that's it. I mean, this is where we are, and I think that we have to understand the way by which Silicon Valley does function as some kind of a magic wand, which allows the otherwise rather grim state of neoliberalism to get a lease on life, which might last for another 10, 20, or how many years you would like to attach to that lease. That's what it is, I think, and that explains why policymakers that are more or less embracing it or not doing anything, they don't have any other alternative in place right now if they want to stick to the basic premises of their own ideological project. But there are many other reasons, and again, that operate at a somewhat lower level of analysis, but nonetheless, I think it's very important to understand them. one of the other reasons why I think there is a natural, almost natural alliance between Silicon Valley and policymakers now is that policymakers themselves, having pursued the neoliberal policy of liberalization of many industries and deregulating the markets, have clearly understood that the neoliberal fairy tale does not really add up in that, you might continue deregulating the food industry, the energy industry, and all the other industries that are out there, but the amount of mess that they generate, whether it's climate change, obesity, or what have you, is just too big for the deregulated market to handle. So the strategy of deregulation of the market is now being pursued in conjunction with the policy of re-regulating or over-regulating the individual, so that the individuals are the ones who are being asked to internalize and take on the costs of the regulated markets, so that it's you, the consumer of energy or food or health or what have you, that will be nudged and manipulated and presented with different options to become more rational by the process of monitoring your behavior with the sensors that are in the built environment, and then by alerting you from whatever screen you happen to be looking at that your behavior is irrational and you need to be doing what your neighbors are doing, or your friends on Facebook are doing, or somebody else is doing who just happens to be more environmentally friendly or have a healthier diet or whatnot. But to me, the only way to understand this kind of fetish for psychologizing problems and the emergence of what some have called the psychological state is precisely by understanding how it fits into what is otherwise a rather deregulated marketplace. Right? With the individuals being the ones who are increasingly regulated. And here it doesn't matter whether you happen to be a social democrat coming from some kind of new labor, which at least in Britain seems to be that, but it has managed to spread in other European states, or you're coming from center-right. Because ultimately, what else are you going to do? Right? I mean, you also have to understand that the fetish for the psychological manipulation in Britain, for example, which I would argue at this point is the birthplace of many of these ideas, at least as they have been formalized in actual policy setting rather than just in theory. In Britain, it was New Labour that brought them in place, in part because for them it was a way to tinker and reform the healthcare and many other systems while still doing something about the negative externalities and consequences of those reforms. So I'm getting closer to the end of my talk. So the question here is then what it is that we can do about the situation, right? And by this point you might be arguing, what does it have to do with surveillance? And I think that the answer to both of those questions is that for me, ultimately, if you define surveillance in a very simplistic way, and this is what I want to do actually now, if you define it simply as the ability of governments to grab more and more data about individuals, right? I mean, they define it very functionally based on the sort of Snowden debate. Yeah, I mean, that's more or less, if you were to talk to most people engaged in this debate, what it is, they tell you that's what it is. There is an essay which just grabs far too much data and we need to do something about it, right? And if you define it in that way, to me, the reason why this is possible is very simple, and it's the fact that a lot of that data is being generated. It's being generated by private companies for all the reasons they have outlined, but it's also being so easily available and it circulates so freely in such a manner because ultimately it's unencrypted. Because if it were encrypted, you wouldn't be able to do all of the data analytics which allows you to sell advertising or use it for governance purposes or use it for nudging or use it for something else. You can have a lot of those services. You can have modern decentralized public transportation system that would not require the operator of the platform to know who you are, where you're going, what other trips you have taken. I mean, you can design those systems. It's not like they're impossible to design, right? But the current configuration of political and economic factors is such that to design them differently, you would need an alternative model for paying for them, right? And since with a tiny exception of a couple of schools of thoughts, if you want to call it that way, who are trying to rethink what the welfare state might look like from the left, having abandoned the traditional institutional model in which it has survived for the last 6 or 7 decades, there is just no alternative for the provision of the services on the left. So you end up with a rather depressive landscape, whereby it's clear that unless you have a better model, how to provide health, transportation, communication, financial inclusion, availability of credit, and so forth, you're not going to move away from this data-intensive surveillance capitalism. So the problem that we have is not that we do not build tools that are very strong when it comes to encryption, or we don't have enough layers of regulation when it comes to the activities of the National Security Agency. But all of that is great, and we should be doing all of those things. Yes, let's regulate the National Security Agency, let's build stronger tools for encryption. But the structural incentives for behavior of individuals who are living under the current nexus between the neoliberal state and Silicon Valley is such that there are reasons why people would like their data to be shared. And unless we manage to address that element of the puzzle, I don't think we'll make any progress, right? So it basically means, and you can actually read this development in a very optimistic manner. And, well, somewhat optimistic manner, I should not overstate the case. To read it in an optimistic manner would be to say that if you really want to challenge surveillance, then you also have to challenge the neoliberal economic paradigm behind it, right? Which might, for some people, sound too ambitious, but for those who are already engaged in those fights, it would actually sound like an extension and an expansion of their project of contestation to another terrain. So if you look, for example, at some of the processes that have been happening on a municipal level, on a city level in Europe, if you look at even in Germany, if you look at what has been happening with the efforts to remunicipalize the provision of water and electricity, some successful, some not in Hamburg or Berlin, where citizens actually try to grab power from corporations and have those services provided outside of the traditional conventional and liberal framework, we'll actually see some interesting, hopeful signs for optimism. You'll see the same if you look at the behavior of some cities in Europe now under the leadership of rather radical mayors in Barcelona and Madrid, for example, to contest many other parts of the neoliberal project, floating ideas about the creation of alternative currencies, floating ideas about the provision of basic income. The city of Utrecht in Netherlands has been experimenting with basic income as a way to move beyond the traditional institutions of welfare and come up with a more robust, resilient model that will allow people to resist some of the pressures that exist on them. I'm saying that only to highlight, and I can go on for an hour trying to explain how this vision of a somewhat different welfare from the left would differ from the one from Silicon Valley. But what I would like to stress here is that there are ongoing contestations of neoliberalism as such, even at the level of infrastructure, right, that are not happening when it comes to the provision of information and telecommunications, nor is it happening to contesting the status of data as a commodity. Right? I mean, there are important fights to be had, which are not being had, in part because social movements that are contesting those things are either unaware of them or they do not have the proper economic analysis of Silicon Valley and how it fits into modern neoliberal project. So with that, I would probably wrap up and we'll open up for questions. But the ultimate sort of takeaway message from it is that I don't think that we'll solve the problem of surveillance unless we solve the problem of the left in general. Right? And solving that problem would be offering a utopian vision or a quasi-utopian vision heavily rooted in technology, because I don't really think you would be able to provide transportation or communication or even health today without a heavy technological layer. So using all of that to articulate a utopian vision of abundance that will contest the basic premises on which the current system functions. And unfortunately, my impression of the Snowden debate so far in the last few years, which has been sort of the leading focal point of the discussions around surveillance, is that this debate has mostly missed that economic and political dimension. And I would say that 3 years have been wasted. But I'm more than happy to be challenged on this point. Thank you.
So we'll take some questions now. Yeah.
Thanks. That was fascinating. So I agree with the overall focus on the political economy of dimension. But where I hesitate is with the idea of using the model of the welfare state in the analysis. And so, and what I'm concerned about mostly is the idea that Silicon Valley is the welfare state. Because it seems as if the logic of the welfare state had very different, at least 3 different theoretical dimensions to it. One would have been a notion of redistribution. I mean, there were at least 3 ways of thinking about the welfare state. One would have been redistribution. One would have been insurance, a very large-scale social insurance, rather than the kind of particularized that we have now. And then the other would have been a rights-based way of thinking about it. Citizenship, the second, civil rights, political rights, socioeconomic rights. But it seems as if here, what we're dealing with really is the value, the economic value of the data, which you yourself recognize. But I think it changes, it's completely, it's no longer, we're no longer in a model of welfare at all, because it's simply that value of the data is what's generating the potential for, say, reduced costs, right? And so if everything turns on the value of that data, though, it's linked also to consumerism. And because, I mean, the only way in which that gains value for the data brokers is through forms of consumerist kind of advertising and encouragement, et cetera. So it's right that it's integrally linked then to neoliberalism. There's no question. But it seems as if it's almost a dead end at that point, because the value of the data is inextricably linked to consumption, purchasing, consumerism. And then, you know, what can you do with it? Well, one thing, I mean, you suggested that, you know, cities could try and cap it and use it. Individuals could privatize it in some way and become owners of the data. But all of those things stay within the framework of a consumerist data link, which, you know, and if we're locked into that, it seems like you're hardly ever going to get out of the neoliberal paradigm.
Sure. So when I speak of the welfare state as the right analogy for Silicon Valley, I'm looking at it mostly from a very functionalist perspective, in that, for me, it seems almost self-evident that if the situation continues as it is now, the bulk of the services that we have associated with the welfare state, whether they were in health, whether they were in transportation, with public transportation, or whether they were in some kind of access to credit, they will be provided by a very different set of actors, or they will be provided by radically changed old actors who will be heavily mediated or in bed with Silicon Valley. In that sense, I don't think that it's inaccurate, because I do not base that analogy on some kind of normative comparison of the two in terms of their goals and agendas. I'm just looking at the actors that have traditionally delivered those services and goods outside of the market framework. So if you look at the history of the welfare, you know, in Europe, that has been some kind of socialist medicine, socialist transportation, socialized education, and so forth. This model will be heavily, well, disrupted for sure, but it will also possibly heavily involve this new set of actors from Silicon Valley in it. In that sense, as a slogan, it might be too reductionist that it's the new welfare state, but clearly I would argue that to understand what these companies are doing, and what impact they will have on how we socialize with each other, how we think about the provision of the services in the city and so forth, in the nation state, you are not that worse off using the welfare state as your starting point of analysis. With regards to data, and with regards to consumerism, I see the overall link, and you can clearly argue that, you know, something like Yelp is only possible by consumerism, and that in a world where we didn't care so much about what sushi we eat on a daily basis, Yelp wouldn't exist. But I don't think that the vast majority of the services I've talked about are like that, in that they do generate a data trail, whether we want it or not. It's just that previously that data trail was heavily distributed. So in the educational setting, you did not have one platform that would come and aggregate all the data points from a particular sector because they happen to run the email system, they happen to run the search engine, they happen to run the main site people use for research, Google Scholar, and everything else, right? It's just that those data points and data trails were there. They were just not necessarily digitized, and they were not necessarily centralized. So in that sense, I wouldn't argue that that data is there only because of our sort of consumerist fetish. So, but I mean, once you put it out on the table, you can then, of course, start thinking about ways in which the flow of data can be slowed down somehow or be brought under a very different economic paradigm. You can argue that if you feel rather cynical or rather desperate about the state of affairs now and you don't believe in any kind of left or any kind of alternative emancipatory paradigm, that you would actually be very well provided for if we just had a very strong system of property rights around data that would accrue to individuals, and they will just harvest your own data and sit on it and not share it with anybody, and thus destroy the commons of data, which at this point only companies like Google and Facebook can exploit because they have the resources, whether it's the ability to make sense of them using AI, or whether it's server farms to make sense of that data. So if you really want to kind of think along the lines of some kind of Agamben destituent power, like the best thing for you is grab your own data and sit on it because that will prevent Google and Uber from improving their services. I mean, you can think along those lines as well. They will cause some disruption. I don't think that that will necessarily be an impediment to the further expansion of those companies, for the reason that, as I've tried to argue in my talk, our use of these sites and platforms at this point is almost conditioned by the changed logic of the social and economic institutions with which we interact. So, I mean, of course I can now, and I don't know whether it will be the case in 5 years from now, I can still opt out not to use a tracking device when I walk around, knowing that my insurance company is not going to discriminate against me or charge me higher or lower rates based on that. Once you move to a world of highly personalized pricing, I don't know if that will be the case, because again, I can opt out and then pay a higher fee. Sure, but that will not be an option available to many people. But the solutions here, they are not, you know, I need another hour to talk about solutions. And so I gave a very simplistic picture of where the world is. But let me just simplify it a little bit. There are, how should I put it? There are contestations of various parts of the neoliberal project, if you will, happening in some parts of the world. Europe, Latin America, other regions present somewhat more complicated analysis. But many elements of the neoliberal system globally and locally are being contested. You know, you can look at the contestation now around the role of, you know, the euro and the European Central Bank. I mean, it's a contestation of certain infrastructural power and capacities through which the neoliberal system exerts its power and dominance. There is very little contestation of actual technical parts of the infrastructure. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about treaties, TTIP, TISA, and all the others, which also form an important part of the infrastructure. We don't spend nearly enough time trying to understand how the project of, you know, the smart city, which is now being rolled out in Europe, but also in Asia, like India wants to build 100 of them in the next 4 years with the help of actually German and American companies. They're not being contested as part of that overall project of contestation. So part of my kind of discursive intervention here is to identify these new sites where that can be contested. There are many things you can say about data, and I clearly am not naive enough to think that all that we need to do is, for example, just to change the status of that data from a commodity into some kind of common Because again, we don't have the infrastructure to make sense of it. The only actors right now who are capable to make sense of that data is Google and Facebook. Because there has not been a robust development of alternative computing infrastructures either by the state or by communities, citizens, the network of cities, whatever you want to call it. That infrastructure is just not there. So anyhow, I'm sort of getting into that mode of talking for another hour to talk about solutions, so maybe I'll stop, but it's complicated.
Okay, so, over here.
Yes.
I don't know where to follow up, but two little things. With the welfare state, I noted down when you were talking, and now I felt confirmed with that, that is it a neoliberal version of the welfare state, or are they simulating one? And I wonder what the gain, the benefit is to think about a simulated welfare state, that they, the simulation of one, which is, that's what I wrote down when you were talking about it. I felt, they simulate a welfare state, and I've yet come to terms with what to make of it, but that's just an idea. And the second idea is, which you didn't talk about, but that doesn't mean that you didn't think about it, is the flip side of the whole thing is the penal state. The security state and the enforced and enhanced penalism, if that word exists, in a way, the punitive state, that at the same time, while this development that you describe goes up and covers everything, the state remains, or the state at the same time has a similar project, only on the side of security, punitive measures and penalism. And there's a link because some of it is also privatized, and there are other links. So there's an important link, I think, that could be made from your talk. I'm not saying you forget about it, but you didn't have another hour then.
The first question, I think, most of them are very interesting, but the first question, to me, goes to the heart of it, because in a sense, the justification for privatization, if you read Thatcher's speeches or Reagan, or even if you go back to Hayek, privatization has never, the argument for privatization has never been that we just want citizens to live under this nasty dictatorship of the market. That's not what they said, right? The argument has always been that by turning to the market and to private institutions, you will be able, there is an argument about freedom, but there is also an argument of efficiency. And the argument of efficiency is that the private sector is just much better positioned to provide those goods in a way that will be cheaper and that will be more enjoyable, more responsible, more responsive to the needs of citizens and so forth. So keeping all those services and goods within some heavily defended and funded public bureaucracy is not just a drag on the budget, it's also a way to offer them in an inferior manner. If you look, if you travel in London and you end up paying, £7 for getting from one point of the city to another, you probably know that the argument about reduced costs, by public transport, you probably know that the argument about reduced costs did not necessarily play out as expected, right? That a lot of, and that's what I was also partly saying about the externalities of the neoliberal system, whether it's the climate change now or the obesity epidemic or whatever. Sorry, I used the word epidemic, but still, how reality is very hard to match with that discourse of everything getting cheaper and better. So alongside that rather drastic outcome, now you have one success story, and the success story that this people will invoke would be that we have privatized the telecommunication sector, and we have privatized information and technology, and now these guys are overtaking everybody else and actually delivering all those goods. So yes, public transportation in London now might cost £7, but just wait until Uber gets hold of everything in London and has enough cars, enough money, they switch to AI system, and it will be even cheaper for you to ride their self-driving bus run by Uber than to take public transport. That's the sort of both the explanation of what has happened and also the utopian vision for sort of where the things will go if we only stay with the status quo. On the penal state, I'm sure Bernard, who follows me, will give you a much better answer. The only thing that I would like to add, which does not have that much to do with the penal system itself, but has more to do with the military and surveillance and the police aspect of this, is that there is clearly, I don't want to say an alliance, but there is some kind of a symbiosis of agendas. And not just agendas, but of certain outlook towards monopolies. If, I mean, there are different types of neoliberalism, and they have very different views on monopoly, but sticking to the more conventional view that still is dominant in Europe, if you were to really believe that we have to break up monopolies because they usurp common good and they usurp competition and they result in inferior outcomes, then something like NSA will need to do 20 times more work than they currently do, because there is just one or two companies that gather all the data in one place for them. It's much harder to work with 20 little companies that compete with Google on all those different dimensions than just to work with Google itself. So in that sense, I think the link between, and of course the argument from Google, and that I think a lot of people working on antitrust in the US have actually accepted, the argument and the response from Google is that by being a monopoly, we can offer you cheaper prices, low cost, and we can also actually invest money that we harvest from being a monopoly into all those moonshot projects that will then allow us to take people to the moon and live forever and whatnot. So, but the basic point here is that there is a certain symbiosis between allowing those monopolies to flourish and the ability of the state, especially in its military and surveillance and police apparatus, to take advantage of that infrastructure which has been set up in such a way that all the data is out there for the grabbing. But it doesn't really get you to the penal aspect, but I'm sure you'll get it later.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
Thanks for the scenario following it. I think one can say that this new welfare state, if you wish, provides the services of the welfare state only there where there is a lot of mobility and change.
Sure.
And not where the traditional welfare state provided it where there was stability, as for example in housing, or where stability was desired. Since also I think the data that they valorize are data that are based on mobility and change. Those are always tendentially the more valuable data. But the kind of character that they produce, the kind of individual that they produce by the pressure that you were describing on, for example, in health scenarios, is based on an idea of reliability and stability, like a kind of a Dutch, North German, Swiss Christian Calvinist character, whose responsibility is towards no change, a reliable life in which there are not many data to gain, and the famous ethics of always taking the curtain, always leaving the curtain open so you can always watch the living room because there are no orgies going on there. So there is also nothing, there are no data to gain from these people, that the pressure that this process would put on them, that these kind of people would be more and more frequent if we would have such a system, and then there would not be no data to gain from them, and they would lose their value.
Sure, no, I mean, look, I think it's, as a comment, I agree with virtually everything you said. I don't have much to add other than to say that, when I set up this analytical framework, I was not trying to argue that and then I think I said it at the beginning, that the match between the old system and the new one is one-to-one. I mean, it's not, and it produces a different subjectivity, it produces a different sort of a relationship that people conceive of between themselves and others. I mean, there are all sorts of consequences here for how people conceive of themselves and of society at large. I also have to, I think we have to stress it, and emphasize it very strongly. If you think about something like Uber, and if you compare it with the previous mode, not just about public transportation, but even if you compare it to the previous model of regulated taxis, right? And these arguments are endless, but just focus on one dimension there. In many cities, regulated taxis and drivers there are required to do a lot of things which generate a lot of costs. So in Vancouver, and it might be the same in New York, but in Vancouver I know for a fact that taxi drivers have to undergo courses on how to cater and care for the blind or disabled, what to do with their wheelchairs and so forth. There is an actual set of training sessions for the drivers, and they are obliged to do that. In Uber's case, all of that is stripped. So the costs of providing a service are, of course, lower, and unless you happen to be blind or disabled, it's actually a net benefit because you end up paying less. All right? So once you define sort of progress, sorry to be using such abstract frameworks, but if you define progress as just the lowering of the cost and the price of the provision of the service, then the practices of those companies, of course, make sense. And if you cannot actually develop any kind of broader feeling of social solidarity between citizens or users of those platforms, you will end up in a situation where, you know, there will be a cluster or a chunk of people who will clearly be worse off under this system. Like, there is no doubt about it. I mean, it's obvious. And then there will be quite a lot who will be better off because they'll be paying less and enjoying life and consuming and whatnot, and who would actually be okay with that because the ties of solidarity that existed before have been cut. Right? But again, I'm putting it in a very simplistic way, and there is clearly, and a lot of it is happening in concurrence, right? It's not a simultaneous, it's not a direct causal chain here. There are also sort of mutual influences between the ideology of Silicon Valley and neoliberalism back and forth. That traffic flows two ways. So it's not just, you know, a very direct causal relationship. Do we need to end? No, I don't know.
So we'll take one more question and then we'll do a short break. We have one in the back.
I don't know if I need a mic. Evgeny, I mean, for many years, a bunch of us have followed your arguments, and even when you were most polemical and bombastic, I mean, you a lot of times hit the nail on the head in ways that people were afraid to say. You know, in the late 90s, for people to say that the internet wasn't going to free the world, you were a nut. I mean, people thought that it was obvious that the internet was going to free the world and bring democratization. So I really appreciate your arguments. However, the one thing you finally said after reading your books and articles for many years that I kind of disagree with, I think, is it seems like you're taking the neoliberal assumptions about cost to their conclusion, in a sense that Uber is going to be cheaper, Airbnb is going to be cheaper, and so on and so forth, when I think the example of, say, what happened with the peak pricing with Uber a few years ago, in a couple of those cases that happened, you know, when all of a sudden, you know, they're in a position where they dominate the market, they have some, like, brief monopoly, all of a sudden they're more expensive than, like, the most overpriced car service, you know, in the Upper East Side. I mean, I think when you say somehow everything's going to get cheaper because it's deregulated and casualized, it doesn't mean that all those profits are also going to go back to the consumer. I mean, that seems to me kind of a backwards assumption going on there.
Sure. It's a fantastic point. So if you look at what has been happening up until now, if you look at historical rates, what Uber has been charging under normal conditions, surge pricing is an odd case. We can talk about that. And Uber has a defense of it, which is we get more drivers on the streets, it benefits. We can talk about that. But if you look at the prices under normal conditions, my understanding is that the prices for an Uber car that, you know, is not a fantastic limo would normally be lower than those of a cab, was up until now. The argument that you have brought up about temporality is interesting because it's not just a matter of them smashing the competition, it's also a matter of them eventually going public and having to open up their books and having to do a lot of other things. I would argue, though, that you also have to factor in the scale at which they operate. And it's the scale that I think will give them the cost optimizations that a company like Walmart can currently get from, they're not the same, clearly, but I mean, this is where the cost optimization comes from. It comes from the fact that they just have so much stuff, so much money, and they have the capacity to do those things in a way that nobody else can do. So, I mean, it's entirely plausible that they will gain dominance in most markets, crush the competition, and then they will start charging more. But even if they don't start charging more, they'll still be a rather profitable company, having crushed all the competition. So, like, I know that, I mean, there are a lot of assumptions here that, you know, we need to, but it's not, let me put it, just one footnote to it. Like, I don't think that the global advertising markets as they currently exist now will be like that forever. I can easily imagine a collapse of advertising markets for one reason. You know, with like this year, we already saw something very weird with ad blockers. You know, suddenly the market that seemed stable and that could continue forever suddenly had a little tiny challenge to it. So some people got worried. They kind of resolved this more or less. But I would argue that if you look at Google now, as a, not Google Now, but Google Now the service, if you look at its logic makes no sense under the current business model of Google because it cannibalizes on search. Google Now works on a principle that Google itself would call autonomous search. So it basically searches for you in the background and then serves you only the results so you don't see the ads, right? So from the perspective of Google's current business model is a suicide. It's not a suicide if Google is the dominant provider of all those services and is in fact generating time for you, which is the condition under which you will actually be paying it. Because there is no other company that, or any other social actor that has so much data about you and has the ability to analyze it and generate time, which will be priced and you will pay for. So again, I don't think I necessarily have a very static vision of where these companies are going. I mean, you can have a lot of dynamism in their models and how it connects to broader trends on the global market and so forth. But right now, I think we have to take them, like we have to start somewhere. And to start somewhere is like, I just look at Uber and yes, you pay less when you take a taxi in most cities. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Evgeny.